Good afternoon, everyone. Kerry Whigham is with us today to speak to us of the long night of the generals, the politicide that traumatized Argentina from 1976 to 1983. Argentina is a new topic for this lecture series. While the terror of the dirty war does not fit the precise requisites of the definition of a genocide, because the UN Convention omits the category of political class. It is a very important case for anyone who wants to understand how a civil society can recover and move forward after suffering the brutality of its own government. This critical question of how a nation can come back, can heal from this kind of trauma, how it can grapple with something like los desaparecidos, is important for all of the genocides we consider in this course, most appropriately for Rwanda, Bosnia, and Cambodia. Kerry is a doctoral candidate in performance studies at NYU. He is the recipient of the Corrigan Pre-Doctoral Fellowship, the Franco Colli Dissertation Award, and NYU's Global Research Initiative Fellowship in Berlin. He has published several articles and chapters, and his dissertation focuses on the subject we consider today, processing collective trauma in post-genocidal countries. Please welcome Kerry Whigham.
Thank you. Thanks. Can everyone hear me? Thank you so much, Diane, and thanks to everyone for inviting me to be a part of this lecture series. I was saying earlier, I really wish I could be here for all of these lectures. The list sounds really fascinating. So I'm here to talk to you today about Argentina. I'm curious, has anyone been to Argentina? Great, a few. Has anyone done any research or know anything about the last military dictatorship in Argentina? Okay, so this will be new information for a lot of you, which is really exciting. I'm happy about that. So from 1976 to 1983, the people of Argentina lived under one of the most repressive and violent military dictatorships of the 20th century. Over the 7-year period, the right-wing military junta that seized power in March of 1976 carried out its Proceso de Reorganización Nacional, a process of national reorganization, but they just called it El Proceso, which sought to eliminate everyone deemed to be a subversive or leftist element across the country. This effort led to the torture, death, and disappearance of as many as 30,000 Argentinians who were kidnapped by the military police and taken to clandestine detention or torture centers spread all across the country. When the families of the victims went to the state or to police offices to try and find out what happened to their relatives, they would discover that all evidence of their family members had been completely erased much of the time. The government acted as if these desaparecidos, these disappeared persons, had never existed to begin with. So I was invited here to speak to you about this violence that occurred in Argentina during its last military dictatorship, which some people call a dirty war, though I'll talk to you about how that's a bit of a problematic term. Others refer to it as a politicide, and still others, including myself, do refer to it as a genocide, and I'll explain why. I know that you've already had over half a semester's worth of lectures on various topics in the field of genocide studies, so I'm sure you're already familiar with the idea, this basic understanding in the field, that we understand genocides not to be merely events, not only the mass killing of large numbers of people, but rather genocide is a long social and political process that begins with much smaller steps within which these victim groups are constructed and ostracized in a way that gradually and incrementally creates a world that allows for this mass killing to take place, for that group to be exterminated. What I hope to show you is that one of the reasons Argentina is such a fascinating case, at least in my opinion, is that it doesn't only illustrate this reality that genocide doesn't just happen overnight, that it involves many, many stages in which certain or various individuals take advantage of various factors in order to destroy certain groups. But Argentina also demonstrates the fact that dealing with the enduring effects of this violence is an equally long and intensive process. And that, for me, is especially exciting because what Argentina shows is the way, is how this process of coming to terms with this violent past is not always and not only the responsibility of the state or of government actors. In the
case of Argentina, it was really everyday citizens, or what in academic or governmental parlance we refer to as civil society, that's you and me, that has made the biggest and most lasting impact in the way that Argentina has dealt with its genocidal past. So this is why I called the presentation today Generations of Memory, Violence, Activism, Memory, and Transitional Justice. I'm getting audio level. Uh-oh, okay. Hello? Okay. Let's see if I can put it in. Okay, I'm just going to hold it. And transitional justice in Argentina. Because in the case of Argentina, this term, generations of memory, actually has a double meaning. Because first we've got the idea of the traumatic memory of the violence of the dictatorship is something that continues to resonate across generations, right? As we know, in every genocide, that violence continues to affect subsequent generations of populations that are affected by this violence. But also why Argentina, is this working? Okay. Why Argentina is so interesting also is because this is highlighting the active stance that these different generations in Argentina have taken in order to generate a culture of memory, to generate a society that acknowledges its own violent past, that's working actively to prevent the return of that violence in the future. So that's what I'm planning on doing with this presentation today. First, I want to explain the steps that led to the perpetration of genocide in Argentina. Second, I'm going to break down the mechanisms of violence that were developed and implemented during this genocide. And third, and perhaps most importantly related to my own research, I want to paint a picture for you of the inspiring and creative ways that Argentinian society, both with and without the support of the state, has addressed its own violent past to create a present and a future that's far less prone to repeat this painful history in the present. So before I go any further, I should articulate one caveat and also outline one idea that's really essential for the way that I approach not only Argentina, but all other genocides that I study as well. So I'll start with the caveat. I refer to the violence that occurred during Argentina's last military dictatorship as a genocide, but not everyone considers this to be such, and as Diane said, if we only go by the definition laid out by the UN Genocide Convention, then Argentina would not be classified as a genocide because political groups are not a protected class within that structure. However, I am not a lawyer, so I don't feel a need to follow the legal definition of genocide. So for several reasons, I prefer the definition outlined by Raphael Lemkin, who of course coined the term genocide in 1944. And Lemkin writes, generally speaking, genocide is intended to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. So we see first off that Lemkin's use of the term national groups is much more open-ended and allows us to consider political groups to be a part of it. But then he goes on to write, the objectives of such a plan would be the disintegration of the political and social institutions of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. I really like this second part of the definition because here what Lemkin is doing is highlighting all of the myriad ways that genocidal violence can function other than the physical destruction of groups. Groups can be destroyed through destroying their social institutions, cultural practices, their economic structures, and these forms of annihilation can have just as enduring effects, an effect on victim groups, as the physical destruction or murder of individuals within the groups. This brings me to my second point. Before I delve into the specifics of Argentina, for me, the violence of genocide doesn't have only this physical force, as we've already said, but also it has this social and affective or emotional force. It's this social and emotional force is that what allows for that physical destruction of groups to occur in the first place. For instance, we can think about the culture of European anti-Semitism that the Nazis took advantage of and cultivated in order to justify the Holocaust. But also that social and emotional force doesn't just disappear when the physical violence ends. So when the Allied forces defeated the Axis powers at the end of World War II and the concentration camps were liberated, it's not as though all of that hatred towards Jews and other social groups that were persecuted suddenly disappeared because the war was over. In fact, that continued to resonate and to perform long into the future. So this social and affective force that continues to perform, that continues to resonate into the future, is what I call resonant violence. And it's this more obscure and less visible form of violence that, when it's not addressed, can continue to manifest in other forms of violence, like the ones that Lemkin outlines in his definition. Other violence against the groups, like enduring social inequality, institutional discrimination, economic disparities among groups. And to understand what I'm talking about, just think about the demographic disadvantages faced by African Americans and Native Americans in this country, the two victim groups who suffered from our own history of genocide and mass atrocity in the US. But the good news is that this resonant violence, when we recognize it, can indeed be dealt with. It can, in fact, be transformed, I think, and I'm going to try to show you, into these new forms of power and political agency. And that, I argue, is exactly what happened in the case of Argentina. So before we get to that more optimistic place, however, we have to first take a step back and look at the violence that preceded it in Argentina. And to do that, we can't really start with the military dictatorship of 1976 to 1983. We have to look at the various factors that led to that dictatorship and that allowed for that large-scale perpetration of violence that would take place during that 7-year period. So here's beautiful Buenos Aires in the early 20th century. If you had been in Argentina at the beginning of the 20th century, it would have seemed incredibly unlikely that several decades later it would devolve into a society that could perpetrate the levels of violence it would see in the 1970s and 80s. So what was going on in Argentina at this time? Well, for one, Argentina had a huge wave of European immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, actually second only to New York, of people immigrating from places like Spain, Italy, and Germany into Argentina and other places as well, Eastern Europe as well. And because of that influx of immigrants, by 1908, Argentina was the 7th wealthiest developed nation in the world. And it's important to point out that at this point it was classified as a developed nation. Argentina is actually one of the only cases we have of a country that was deemed to be a developed nation actually regressing into, today we refer to it as a developing nation. So that's a real anomaly. And I'm going to try to explain why that happened. It was the top 5 in world exporters. It had a higher per capita income than Denmark, Canada, and the Netherlands. And it had higher literacy rates than most other Latin American countries would reach even half a century later. So given all of this prosperity, what happened to transform it into a country that could perpetrate the violence that we will see? Well, several factors really contributed to creating an environment that would allow for the perpetration of that genocide. And they all really started with the world economic crisis of 1929, what we most often refer to as the Great Depression. This economic crisis, of course, didn't only hit the US, it was really affected the economic structure of the entire world, and Argentina, as one of the major economic powers in the world at the time, was deeply affected by it. And the economic instability in Argentina led to a number of military coups through which the military was seeking to stabilize the government and stabilize the economy of Argentina. So before the coup of 1976, which is this major coup that we're talking about, there were 5 other military coups in the 20th century in 1930, 43, 55, 62, and 66. So the first one was within a year of when the stock market crashed in 1929, right? So each of these coups was trying to install a military government and a specific type of governmental regime that Argentinian sociologist Guillermo O'Donnell refers to as bureaucratic authoritarian regimes. So what's a bureaucratic authoritarian regime? O'Donnell says that it's characterized by several different things. One, it's a system of government that's controlled by and balanced toward the economic elites who are trying to protect their own economic stability in a period of great economic instability. 2, It's characterized by the suppression of citizenship and the exclusion of civil society. So basically trying to block out anyone except the economic elites from being able to control or have any influence over the way the country is governed. And three, and very importantly, bureaucratic authoritarian regimes are directed towards privatization and the establishment of what they refer to as economic order, but what increasingly we can read as being policies of economic neoliberalism. And I'll explain more specifically what I mean by that very shortly. During these military coups, Argentina also developed a history of oppression and torture of political opponents. So especially starting in the military regimes following the 55 and the two coups in the 60s, they started imprisoning political opponents and using torture techniques against them. Most famously, the electric cattle prod started to be used. That's a technique that they would continue to use and then even build upon further in the dictatorship of 1976 to 83. And then the final thing I'll point out is factors that were leading to the genocide of the 70s to 80s. Next week you're going to hear from Jim Waller, who's a friend of mine and also a real mentor of mine in the field of genocide studies. And he's going to talk to you about the way that ordinary people, ordinary individuals are converted into being perpetrators of genocide during these periods of mass violence and killing. And one thing he says is that societies that have a high authority orientation, meaning a high likelihood to follow or respect people in authority without questioning it, are potentially more likely to commit genocide. Not all the time, but it's a risk factor. And Argentina, in some cases, can be seen as having this high authority orientation, and it's represented most clearly through Peronism, which is the central political movement of Argentina. Peronism is a really interesting mix of populism, but with a strong, central, charismatic, often authoritarian figure, and that's represented initially by Juan Domingo Perón, who, of course, Peronism is named for him. And the rise of Peronism in Argentina, starting in the 1940s, led to the development of a government that had a disproportionately powerful executive branch. There weren't a lot of checks and balances, and in fact, that's a political model that is still very much in existence in Argentina today. The executive really has a disproportionate amount of the power, and the legislative and judicial branches, to a certain extent, are subject to that executive power. Less with the judicial branch today, but still very much so with the legislative branch. So let's look at what is this rise of Peronism, and how did that lead to the perpetration of this violence. So here we have Juan Domingo Perón. If you haven't heard of Perón, you've almost certainly heard of his wife, Eva Perón, or Evita. If not from history, then from the musical or the movie with Madonna. Aren't they the couple? Perón is often thought about as being an authoritarian or a dictatorial leader, but it's important to recognize that he was democratically elected in 1946. He rose to power and was always democratically elected. He did rise to popularity because of his role in the military government that followed the 1943 coup, but he was a democratically elected figure. And he and his wife, Eva, were extremely popular with the working classes, who they called the descamisados, the shirtless ones, and they called themselves that. They would walk through the streets, Perón and Evita, and everyone would take off their shirts and wave them in support of them. The Perons really expanded workers' rights, and they also are responsible for extending the right to vote to women. Eva Perón died of cancer in 1952 at the end of Perón's first term as president. And after that, Perón was still elected for a second term that same year. While they were so popular with the working class, he was extremely disliked by the elites, and they were constantly working to remove him from power because of the way he was favoring the working classes. And ultimately, they succeeded. Perón was displaced by a military coup in 1955, and he was forced into exile, and he left the country for 17 years. He wasn't allowed to return. And during that time, Peronism was completely outlawed. You couldn't be a Peronist anymore. During this period of exile, a lot of really fascinating and important things were happening. all around the world, but in Latin America specifically. Around the world, what's the main thing going on at this time? The Cold War. The whole world is being divided between those who supported the rise of communism and those who are against and fighting actively against the rise of communism. And that's represented most clearly in Latin America through the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s. Of course, one of the main leaders of the Cuban Revolution is Che Guevara, who is himself an Argentinian. So all over Latin America, we see the emergence and growth of these new leftist political guerrilla organizations that are fighting for the rise of the left and of socialism in Latin America, and they are sometimes using violence, armed violence, to do that. Sometimes not all the time. The two biggest groups to emerge in Argentina are the Montoneros, who are a Peronist, a pro-Perón faction, and the Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, the People's Revolutionary Army. That's an anti-Peronist faction. So both fighting for the rise of the left, both fighting for communism. One's for Perón, one's against Perón. It's very strange. Argentinian politics are really difficult to understand. I still don't understand them. But after the fall of the 1966 to 1973 dictatorship, a very different Perón returns to Argentina in 1973. And the most clear example of how he's a different Perón is that when he flies into Ezeiza Airport, the main airport of Argentina, all the Montoneros are there welcoming him, cheering his return, and he orders an attack against the Montoneros, which is known as the Ezeiza Massacre. It's a very important moment in recent Argentinian history. So many of these Montoneros were killed, and it really represented this moment where people realized this is a different Perón who's returned, and he's going to be fighting against the rise of the left in Argentina and in Latin America. Okay, so he returns, he's re-elected president. This time he has a new wife, Maria Estela Martinez, but everyone refers to her as Isabelita, or Little Isabel. It's a very pejorative name. They really didn't like her. But she's his vice president. They both begin fighting actively these leftist groups, these guerrilla organizations. Perón dies in 1974, a year after he takes office, and this creates a huge power vacuum in Argentina. And now, Isabelita is the new president. She's trying to fill that power vacuum by going even harder against political opponents and the rise of the left. She creates an arm of the government called the Alianza Anticomunista Argentina, or the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, the AAA. And this group began the work of disappearance of individuals that would become even more pervasive during the dictatorship. So this is one really important thing to realize about Argentina. The disappearances and the political oppression that we most often associate with the dictatorship actually started during a period of democracy. Still, despite the fact that she was really fighting these people and killing large numbers of people to fight the rise of the left, the military still didn't think she was doing enough. And on top of that, the military, like many other countries in Latin America, had the support of the United States. The United States was doing everything they could to make sure that communism didn't happen in Latin America, their quote-unquote backyard. They were funding and backing most of the military coups that were happening in Latin America at that time. So with the support of the United States and other Latin American countries in the region, the military performed another coup on March 24th, 1976, ousting Isabelita and beginning their process of national reorganization. So what did this process look like? What did this violence look like? This was a process that wanted to eliminate completely those who were deemed to be political subversives or leftists from the country. People who were political subversives were deemed not to be Argentinian. They were excluded from the sphere of citizenship and humanity, and they were trying to eliminate them completely from the national scene. As I said, this period is often called the Dirty War. It's a very popular term, but this is a bit of a problematic term, especially in Argentina, because that's a term that was developed by the military to make it seem like what they were doing was fighting a civil war against two groups with equal amounts of power fighting against each other. And that was indeed not the case. This was although the leftists were occasionally using violence. The level of that violence was nothing in comparison to the military's might, and so to call it the dirty war really obscures the one-sided nature of the oppression. As I said also, it's important to realize that this dictatorship, like most of them in Latin America, was intricately connected to the introduction of a neoliberal economic regime. What do I mean by neoliberalism here? As Eric Hirschberg and Fred Rosen say, this is about the opening of Latin America's economies to foreign investment and trade by way of privatization of public activity, deregulation of private activity, and production primarily for export and fiscal austerity. We're talking about an unregulated free market that only and disproportionately advantages the economic elites, the dismantling of the welfare state completely, and the elimination of any form of social safety net for the middle or working classes. This was a very skewed economic system. What were the forms of oppression and repression that the military junta were using in order to install this economic regime? Here we have a picture on your right is Videla, who was the first president of the military regime. He was the head of the army. And to the left is Macera, who was the head of the Navy, and he was really the mastermind behind developing the techniques of violence that would be used during the dictatorship. So, immediately when they took office, they shut down Congress and the Supreme Court. All political parties and labor unions were banned. Universities and media outlets were completely under the control of the state, so what was being taught in schools and what was being broadcast on public media had to be approved by the regime. There were national curfews being put in place. I think everyone had to be home by 9 o'clock, which for those of you who have been to Argentina, you know that dinner doesn't even start till 10 o'clock, so this is especially hard for Argentinians. But the violence of this dictatorship was reflected in even the most basic aspects of daily life. As Diana Taylor says, the physical semiology of the population changed. This is an image taken from an educational flyer published by the military and circulated through the education system. And you see it says, así sí, así no. Like this, not like this. And on the left we have this image of this very clean-cut couple, the man in a suit, the woman in a dress, hair very nicely coiffed. On the left, or on the right, your right, it's more like a sort of hippie couple. The guy's got long hair, the woman's wearing pants, real dangerous folk. And the text that accompanied this, it said males need to have short hair, ears visible, no beard, classic trousers, jacket, shirt, and tie. Females, hair pulled back, white apron covering shirt, blouse, or sweater, shirt buttoned at the neck, or white undershirt. If trousers are worn, they must be navy blue. No makeup. For both sexes, it's prohibited to wear blue jeans or colored clothing under aprons. One could be arrested during this period for dressing the wrong way. You could be called a political subversive if you dressed like the people on the left, if you wore blue jeans. For saying anything wrong against the regime. For having the wrong book. If you were in school and you were studying Marx, for instance, and you were caught with a copy of Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto, you would be deemed a political subversive and you could be disappeared. If you were associating with the wrong people. It was illegal to stop and talk to people on the street. In public space, you always had to keep moving through public space. You couldn't stop and congregate because the regime saw that as potentially conspiring against the regime. Okay? So political activists, of course, were particularly vulnerable to this, and many of the people who were disappeared were political activists who had been or were fighting actively against the military regime. But anyone could have been a victim. If you had an enemy, if your neighbor didn't like you, your neighbor could go to the police, say that you were a political subversive, and you would almost certainly be disappeared. And you would have no recourse. And your family would have no recourse. So what does this lead to? If anyone around you could inform upon you, if everyone could be the person that turns you in and that ends your life, it creates this environment that Hannah Arendt refers to as the ubiquity of the informant. The idea that anyone could be the one that turns you in. So what's the result of that? When anyone can turn you in, the society atomizes. Everyone isolates themselves. You start only associating and being around the people who you know you can trust, your very closest family, maybe some friends. But really it's about shutting yourself away and not congregating with other people because you never know what's going to happen. And why is that good for the military regime? Well, when you're only with yourself and your family, you can't form any form of resistance to the regime. So it then perpetuates their power over you. Another way that they created that, hold on, let me have a Marco Rubio moment. So we've got this ubiquity of the informant. Another way that they were creating that sort of environment was through the main technique of violence that they developed during this time, which is called disappearance. So what do I mean when I say disappearance, when they were talking about someone being disappeared? Well, if you were deemed to be a political subversive, you could be walking along the street one day or in your home. A car would pull up. Most often it was a Ford Falcon. It's a very notorious car still in Argentina. Some men would get out of the car, throw you into it, drive off, and your friends and family would never see or hear from you again. If they would go to the police office or to a ministry and ask what happened to you, they would either say, if you were a man and you were disappeared, they would say, oh, your son just ran off to marry a prostitute in another country. Or if you were a woman, they'd say, your daughter ran off to be a prostitute in another country. Or, most likely, they would say, we have no record of that person ever existing. If the family showed them a driver's license or a birth certificate or a photograph, they would take it and destroy it oftentimes and say that this is falsified documentation. We don't have any information that this person existed. So you really had no recourse. The family had no recourse and no idea what was happening. President Videla really explained this idea of disappearance really well. Here's another guy being detained. When he said, no están ni vivos ni muertos, están desaparecidos. They are neither alive nor dead. They are disappeared. So the disappeared are framed as being in this sort of in-between space. But not only the disappeared are in this in-between space, it's the family and friends of the disappeared who are also in this in-between space who have no idea what happened to their family members. Because of this, we can think of disappearance as being this inherently affective or emotional strategy to terrorize the population, because it was meant not only to affect the person being disappeared, but to destabilize and terrorize the entire country. Diana Taylor writes, the military spectacle made people pull back in fear, denial, and tacit complicity from the show of force, and therein lay its power. The military violence could have been relatively invisible, as the term disappearance suggests. The fact that it wasn't indicates that the population as a whole was the intended target. So right now, we think the numbers that we have are somewhere between around 9,000 to 30,000 people disappeared. It's still unclear exactly what the number is. But the victims of that violence were not just those 9,000 to 30,000. It was the entire population who were made to fall in line with the regime because of fear that they could be next. They could be also disappeared, and therefore they need to support the regime. So this led to a phenomenon that Diana Taylor calls percepticide. Percepticide is from the killing of perception. It's the willful blindness that happens during periods of genocide when, out of self-preservation, out of a desire to make sure that you're not the next one to be disappeared or killed, you pretend not to see the violence that's happening around you. So here you have an image. This is a classic image of several young people being detained. They will most likely be thrown into a car and disappeared moments from this picture. And in the window there, it's a little cafe. And you can't see it well with this picture, but it's a woman turning away and not looking at this violence that's happening around her. That's percepticide. That's what happens in almost all genocidal regimes. And in fact, it's required for the genocide to continue happening, for people to pretend not to see it. This atomization of the population that occurred during the military dictatorship, we can think of it as an example of what O'Donnell, who I mentioned earlier, has called the silencing of the collective vertical voice of the population. So according to O'Donnell, there are two different voices, quote unquote, when it comes to responding to any political power. We have vertical voice, which refers to the act of someone of a lower social status speaking to those in positions of power or of authority. And the exercising of vertical voice can be really benign. Like, for instance, if I wrote a letter to a congressman or to the head of a company, that's an example of vertical voice. But it can also be quite risky, especially in an authoritarian regime. Having that sort of speaking up to someone in power can be quite risky. Likewise, horizontal voice describes the act of people who feel themselves to be on the same level, socially, politically, economically. When those people speak with each other and organize around shared ideas in order to form sort of a collective we. When this new group, which has been formed from the power of horizontal voice, collectively addresses their thoughts and feelings to those in political power, that is them exercising collective vertical voice. And for O'Donnell, a society can only describe itself as being truly democratic when it places no restrictions on horizontal voice and therefore, consequently, no restrictions on collective vertical voice. So political protest is an example of collective vertical voice. In the case of the Argentinian military dictatorship, they were using a method of governance that O'Donnell refers to as divide and rule. So while occasionally citizens were allowed to use vertical voice individually to speak to those in power, though it didn't do much good, they were never allowed to exercise that vertical voice collectively, and the use of horizontal voice was completely forbidden. During this regime, groups of every kind were suspect. Political parties, music or theater groups, clubs, just like I said, the gathering of people talking on a street corner. So this was a process that O'Donnell refers to as desciudadanización or de-citizenization. It's about actually turning people not into citizens anymore, to just make them subjects of political power, to take away any rights that they have to influence or have a say in the way that they're governed. So this is what was happening to the broader population as this dictatorship was exercising its power. Now, what happened to the people who were disappeared? Well, when you were disappeared, you would be taken to one of around 500 different clandestine detention, concentration, and torture centers spread across the country. This is a map that shows different centers around the country. On your right that's just the city of Buenos Aires. You can see there were 43 centers in there. These centers could be private homes of people who were friendly with the dictatorship. They were police stations. The largest center, which is known as ESMA, which I'm going to talk a lot more about later, was a military training school for the Navy. And it was still operating as a military training academy while people were being concentrated, detained, and tortured and killed there. The officers, when you were detained in these places, they were using techniques actually that they learned again from the United States by attending the School of the Americas, which is a training school that the U.S. operated in Panama, where military officers would come to Panama, to the School of the Americas, and be taught all different methods of torture that they could use to root out political subversion in their countries. Most Latin American countries learned the techniques that they would use by attending the School of the Americas from the U.S. military. And also, just so you know, the School of the Americas is still in operation. It has a different name now. It's now called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, and it's no longer in Panama now, it's in Fort Benning in Georgia. But again, to show how the U.S. was really complicit in a lot of this violence that was happening. The military officers would use the techniques they learned at the School of the Americas to torture the victims. They would beat them, use electric shock. Oftentimes this violence would be really sexualized, so women would often, the electric shock would to their genitals. Women were raped. I've read about some testimonies of people being tortured by being buried up to their neck, and then insects and bugs were crawling over their faces so that they couldn't do anything about having their faces being eaten away by these insects. They called this process questioning because it was about trying to get information out of them, but what they really wanted was to get those prisoners to name names of other subversives who could then be disappeared, and the same thing could happen to them. The prisoners were also forced to perform slave labor. The most popular form was to have them create false government documents that would then be used to support their claims of what happened to the disappeared, to their families, or to the public, wider public, making them complicit in their own imprisonment. Around 500 of people who were disappeared were pregnant women at the time that they were disappeared. And rather than killing them right off, they would allow them to give birth, then they would kill the mother, and the baby was given to military families or friends of military families to raise as their own. So that happened to around 500 children who are alive today in Argentina, and only some of them now know that their real parents were killed by the state, and that their parents who have pretended to be their biological parents all of their lives are, in fact, they're illegal appropriators. When the army or the military felt like they had all the information they could get from the prisoners, the victims would be stripped naked, drugged, and then flown in airplanes or helicopters over the Rio de la Plata, the big river next to Buenos Aires, and thrown into the water. And the reason they used this method, these were called death flights. The reason they used this method is because the regime was very complicit, the Catholic Church was very complicit with the regime, the military regime. And the military went to the Catholic priests and said, what's the most moral way that we can kill these people? And they said, well, you should drug them and then throw them in, because then it's not you killing them, they're killing themselves because they can't swim. So still, bodies are being found today along the banks of the Rio de la Plata. And I don't know if any of you saw, President Obama visited Argentina last week on the 40th anniversary of the military coup. And he and the current president, Mauricio Macri, visited the river and threw white roses into the river as a sign of honor for these and remembrance of the victims whose bodies are still in the river today. Okay. So to this point, I've really tried to paint a picture for you of the physical, social, and affective violence of the dictatorship. You've seen how the worst of these atrocities were preceded by a long line of contributing factors, how this violence didn't just emerge overnight. Now what I want to do is focus on the other side of that process, the long journey of addressing the resonant violence of genocide. And as you'll see, this process in Argentina was not an easy one. Neither was it one that proceeded inevitably forward. It had a number of fits and starts, periods of progression and then regression. And indeed, the work of responding to the past violence is not over in Argentina. It still preoccupies contemporary politics in Argentina. What's particularly fascinating about it to me, though, is that unlike some other genocides, a number of the groups that started resisting this violence and trying to process and respond to that violence started to emerge even within the period of the dictatorship itself. These groups responding to and resisting the horrific violence taking place around them. So I want to turn to thinking about that resistance. As much as the military junta tried to silence the collective vertical voice of the people, they could not fully succeed. Several very important groups emerged to denounce the dictatorship publicly and fight against it at great risk to themselves. I'm going to talk about two of them that were particularly important. And most famously, the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, or the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. This was a group of women whose children were disappeared by the dictatorship. They were most often housewives or people who were just working at home, whose children were disappeared. They had no political engagement until this point. The first mothers met while they were filing claims at the Ministry of the Interior, trying to find out what happened to their kids in 1977, less than a year after the dictatorship started. And then they started to meet in each other's homes. And then, on the 30th of April 1977, about a year after the dictatorship began, 14 of the mothers gathered in the Plaza de Mayo, which is the central square of Buenos Aires. This is an image from much later when many more mothers would join, but on that first day it was just 14 mothers. The Plaza de Mayo is a really important spot in Buenos Aires. You see here the column that's there to symbolize that is the spot where the Declaration of Independence from Spain was signed. But also the way that it's placed in Buenos Aires is really important. It's right in front of the presidential palace, or the seat of executive power, executive political power. Also in front of the National Cathedral and in front of the National Bank. So the three centers of executive political power, religious power, and economic power, the three forces that were conspiring together during the period of the dictatorship. So that's why they were meeting in the Plaza de Mayo. They first went there and started standing still and demanding the return of their children, but the police told them, as I told you, it was illegal to stand still in public space. You had to keep moving, so they started walking in a circle around the central column. And then they decided, we don't want to call this walking because we're here with a purpose. We're walking to somewhere. So they started calling it marching. The numbers continued to grow until hundreds of mothers were involved, and they really worked together. If the police went up to one mother and demanded her papers, then all of them would rush up to that officer and say, if he wants to take that one mother's papers, he would have to take everyone's papers. Some of the mothers were disappeared, in fact, several of them. But really the biggest strategy that the military used to fight against the mothers was to just refer to them always as las locas, the crazy ladies. Just always talk about them as crazy people who we shouldn't even listen to. They're recognizable because they always wear these white scarves when they're marching or in public places, or in public, appearing as mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. These scarves are called panuelos, and they actually didn't begin as scarves. They started as cloth diapers that they were using to symbolize their positions as mothers. Still to this day, they refuse to acknowledge the death of their children. Their main slogan is Aparición con vida, which roughly translates to, we want them back alive, bring them back alive. They say, you took them from us alive, we want them back alive. Because the state still hasn't been able to even give them remains, they still act as if their children are alive. To be clear, they all know that their children are not alive anymore, but it's a political statement that they're making. When they present themselves as mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, they refuse to acknowledge the death of their children and still demand them. So they still march to this day, every Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock, every Thursday. Another smaller group that's related to this are the abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. This is a subset of the mothers, specifically the mothers whose pregnant daughters were disappeared. And these women are specifically fighting for the return of their grandchildren who they know were born in captivity. And I'm going to talk more about them later on. So ultimately, the work of these civil society groups that were performing their work at great risk to themselves during the perpetration of this violence was doing an incredible amount to start dismantling the power of the junta. But the real linchpin that made everything fall apart was the Malvinas or Falkland Islands War. The Malvinas, or the Falkland Islands, are these two islands off of the coast of Argentina. They're British territory, but over a century ago they used to be Argentinian, and the Argentines still declare them as Argentinian to this day. It's still a very popular move to talk about the Malvinas as Argentine land. So the military junta tried to play off of that political excitement and energy, this very populist move of reclaiming the Malvinas as Argentine, taking them away from the British. So in April of 1982, the military regime invaded the Falkland Islands to reclaim them as Las Malvinas. They had incredible amounts of public support, and this is something that most Argentinians won't talk about today. But in fact, when the junta declared, this is the speech of declaring they're going to war. This is the Plaza de Mayo, full of people in support of the regime going to war. They were mothers of the Plaza de Mayo fighting weekly for the return of their children, and they were still in support of this war. That's how popular it was. But the regime really miscalculated what the results of this would be. They did not think that the UK would send their army to defend this island with something like 300 inhabitants halfway across the world. They were very wrong. Margaret Thatcher sent the full might of the British Navy, and within 2 months, Argentina lost the war, and this destroyed confidence completely in the dictatorship. After this, it was really only a matter of time before the dictatorship fell apart, and the junta had to step down. They held democratic elections on October 30th of 1983, and Raúl Alfonsín was elected president, the first democratically elected president, inaugurated in December of 1983, bringing an end to 6.5 years of this dictatorship, of that violence. Almost immediately, no, not almost, immediately, Alfonsín began the first official governmental efforts to address the violence of the dictatorship. And he wanted to start with a period with finding out the truth of what had happened over the past 7 years. Alfonsine began his presidency with widespread support from the public, but the military was still incredibly strong. And throughout this period, the threat of another military coup was always imminent. Despite this fact, though, Alfonsine was beginning this revolutionary strategy of what today we call transitional justice. I don't know if you guys have talked at all about transitional justice in your classes. It's just this big, broad term that we use to talk about the various ways that governments deal with the violence of the past, deal with past human rights abuses. Most commonly, they include things like truth commissions, trials, criminal prosecution, institutional reform to get rid of people who were perpetrators of violence from government institutions, and reparations, financial reparations. Those are the four main categories. Today we call that transitional justice. At the time, it wasn't called that because it didn't exist. There wasn't a field of this. Alfonsine was making it up as he went along, and it's incredible what he and his administration did. So as I said, this began with a process of trying to find truth. Alfonsine, within 10 days of taking office, created the first truth commission in the history of the world, called, the translation of it is the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, CONADEP for the Spanish acronym. And the report of that Truth Commission, which was called Nunca Más, was released in 1984, less than a year later, and it became an instant bestseller. And it really told us some of the beginning information that we're now getting even more information. We have more information today. It lists almost 9,000 people disappeared. As I said, that number now believed to be as high as 30,000. It talks of around 500 clandestine detention centers, 500 children appropriated by military regimes illegally, roughly 40,000 people forced into exile during this period, hundreds of businesses closed and co-opted by the regime. Even given this Truth Commission information, the military still refused to accept that any of this happened. They always said that they were fighting a civil war, like I said, and they said that these figures are very exaggerated. Still today, the military exists in what they call a cone of silence, where they won't give testimony against other military figures about what happened during the period of the dictatorship. But importantly, Alfonsine didn't stop with just the Truth Commission. He found out what happened, and then he wanted to take it to the next step of justice. In 1985, the Alfonsine government put the top 9 orchestrators of the crimes of the dictatorship on trial. This was the first time since the Nuremberg trials that a democratic government tried its own former leaders, and it was the first time in the history of modern history when it was done completely domestically, without international support or intervention. They made a deliberate decision to try not the rank-and-file killers, but only the architects of the crimes. And ultimately, as a result, Videla and Macera, the 2 guys you saw in the picture, were given life sentences. 3 others were given extended prison sentences, and 4 of the people were acquitted. By the time the trials ended, they really thought further justice was impossible. And that's mainly because even during the trials and the Truth Commission, several new coup attempts were going on, and one of them nearly succeeded. There was almost another dictatorship in the mid-1980s that thankfully did not succeed. But because of those political realities and because the military threat Alfonsine and his regime made some new decisions, and this led to a transformation away from these revolutionary measures of transitional justice to what is referred to now as Argentina's period of impunity. So as I said, the process of responding to and transforming resident violence in Argentina was not a short one, and it underwent a series of steps forward and steps back. This period of impunity marks the biggest and longest step backward when it comes to the state's own measures for dealing with the past. And I'm talking about it because, again, I want to show you that dealing with the past is just as much a process, a long process and a difficult process, as the process of making genocide happen to begin with. This period of impunity was institutionalized through a series of laws. The first law was in 1986, and it was called the Law of Full Stop. So this set an end date, 60 days after the law was passed, beyond which no cases could be brought against the military regime for crimes perpetrated during the period of the dictatorship. That was followed the next year by the to obedience law, which said that no one could be prosecuted if they were following orders. So these two laws basically made it impossible to try anyone for crimes committed during the dictatorship. But then they didn't stop there. They actually made this period of impunity even stronger. In 1990, a man named Carlos Menem was elected as president. He was a far-right conservative who really advocated for forgetting completely about the past and just, quote-unquote, moving forward. He not only tried to keep in place the economic structures that were set up by the dictatorship, but he wanted to extend them even further. He wanted to destroy all former clandestine detention centers because he didn't want to leave them as evidence that could be used for trials, didn't even want to mark them as sites of memory. And most importantly, on Christmas Eve of 1990, less than a month after he was inaugurated, he granted full presidential pardons to all participants in the dictatorship, and that included those who were already in prison and had been tried. So Videla and Macera, for instance, were no longer under terms of life imprisonment. They were released from prison and given a full pardon. So while the state was totally absconding from their responsibility for the crimes of the past during the late 80s and all throughout the 90s, it then became ordinary citizens, particularly the family members of the victims and other civil society organizations, that picked up the torch and continued fighting for an active process of dealing with the past. So even during this period of impunity, the forces outside of the government were working hard to fight against oblivion or forgetting, fighting for memory, and fighting for the return of justice. So the grandmothers kept searching for their grandchildren, the mothers kept marching, and in this important moment in the 1990s, the mid-1990s, just as the grandmothers gave birth to the mothers and the mothers to the children who were disappeared, a new generation of activists came of age during this period, and that's the children of the people who were disappeared. And they formed a group too, called Hijos. Hijos in Spanish means sons and daughters, but in this case it's an acronym that means Sons and Daughters for Identity and Justice, Against Oblivion and Silence. And this is one of the main groups that I worked with in my research. They were formed in the city of Cordoba by about 70 people sons and daughters whose parents had been disappeared by the military dictatorship. They formed during Easter week of 1995. And within months, their membership grew to over 350 members and to spread across 14 different cities across the country, and that would continue to spread. They did a lot of important things. But the most important contribution, the biggest contribution they made, not only to Argentina but to the world, is this specific mode of political protest they developed called the escrache. Escrache is the unique form of public activism developed by Hijos to respond specifically to the lack of formal justice and punishment for former perpetrators of torture, detainment, and genocide during the military dictatorship. So the word comes from the Spanish verb escrachar, which is a slang verb. It means to uncover or to bring something to light, and that's exactly what they were trying to do with the escraches. Their goal was to make the public aware of the unpunished perpetrators who were living among them, and in lieu of the formal punishment that the state was unwilling to execute, they wanted to levy a different type of justice that they called a condena social, or a social sentence. So the escrache itself was this loud, theatrical, carnivalesque event. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of people would gather at a central meeting place, and then they would march through the streets, through a neighborhood, playing music, singing songs. There were bands. They would chant political statements. They would have puppets. Until they reached the house of the unpunished perpetrator that they had targeted for that specific escrache. At the home, the music and the chanting would continue. They often performed sort of humorous or ironic acts. For instance, I'm going to show you a video of one where they were hanging pizza boxes on fishing poles over the police barricades and chanting, "You would kill your own mother for a slice of pizza." Some of the leaders of Hijos would then deliver a speech that would articulate the crimes of the perpetrator and announce his social sentence. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Meanwhile, the participants would mark the house with brightly colored paint that let everyone know that a murderer was living in that place. By the end of the escrache, the house would be splattered with this red paint. They would empty out eggs and then refill them with red paint so they could throw them over the police barricades and mark the house with them. And then they would also paint graffiti on the streets and sidewalks in front of the house in big bright letters that would say things like, here hides a free perpetrator of genocide. After all this, the participants marched away from the perpetrator's home, and they would leave the neighborhood to act upon this new knowledge that they had received. So I'm going to show you a really short clip from an escrache from 2002. This is against Luis Donosik, and you'll see a lot of the stuff I'm talking about.
Y Donosik, ya estás escrachado. Aunque tapes tu casa con esta triste lona verde militar, el repudio del barrio no lo vas a poder tapar. Porque mientras los vecinos usan el toldo para protegerse del sol, vos lo usás para seguir ocultándote. Pero ya es tarde, te llegó la hora del escrache, Donosik. Si no hay justicia, hay escrache. Pide libre a Donosik. No olvidamos, no perdonamos, no nos reconciliamos. 30.000 compañeros detenidos desaparecidos. ¡Presentes! ¡Ahora y siempre! ¡Ahora y siempre! ¡Ahora y siempre!
So the escrache is an example of what I refer to as a co-embodied practice, which are these embodied acts that are carried out by groups of people acting in concert to some sort of shared goal and in public space. To be clear, these co-embodied practices can be both positive or negative. For instance, we can think of genocide itself as being a co-embodied practice of people in public space acting towards a shared goal. But when they are directed towards positive means, and the escrache is an example of this, I argue, they can be tools for transforming that past violence or this resonant violence into new forms of agency, into new forms of political power. So the ultimate goal of the escrache was to let me tell you, the escraches were deeply organized events. They were not spontaneous by any means. They would usually start about 2 months before the big event themselves, when the hijos would go into the neighborhood where the perpetrator lived. They would rally people together and they would paint colorful murals on the street that would let everyone know hijos is here, there's going to be an escrache. They would get school children to participate in painting the murals too. They would use graffiti and mark walls with their main slogan, which is Si no hay justicia, hay escrache. If there's no justice, there is escrache, which is their promise that as long as there aren't trials against the perpetrators, they will keep making escraches. They would create these flyers and go door to door and put them in mailboxes, hand them out and talk to people on the street. The flyers would have the photo of the perpetrator, his name, address, telephone number, and all of the information of the crimes that he perpetrated. They did a lot of research to find out exactly what this person did, and they picked the people that they were doing this escraches against specifically because they could find enough information about them. And then they would try to rally people to come to be a part of the escrache this way. They also worked with other groups. This is a group of artists called Grupo de Arte Callejero, or like street art group. They made these street signs. And like this one says, 100 meters from here is Ernesto Fremont Weber, perpetrator of genocide, and then it gives his address. So you see them sort of co-opting the language of the state to perform in a funny way the role that the state isn't performing. So all of this, the ultimate goal of the escrache, as I said, was to rally the rest of the community to join them in the issuing of what they called a social sentence, a condena social. And tell you what I mean, I'll use a quote from Julieta, who's a 28-year-old member of Hijos. Her father, aunt, and uncle were all disappeared. And this is how she explains it. She says, given the absence of a legal sentence, there must exist a social sentence. What we pursue is that the perpetrator's own house becomes his jail, that his own neighborhood and neighbors sentence him in the daily things, in his daily life. The social sentence makes the baker decide not to sell him bread any longer, the taxi driver not to take him. We want him and his past to stop being a mystery to the neighborhood. So the most recognized slogan of Hijos, as I said, is "Si no hay justicia, hay escrache." If there's no justice, there is escrache. What Julieta is demonstrating here is how the escrache was more than an act of protest. It was actually performing the act of judgment that the state was refusing to perform. So the escrache represented the issuing of a social sentence that must then be carried out by the people of the neighborhood. And because of this, the performance of the escrache was only the beginning of this much larger process in which Hijos did not take part. And this process of condemnation was left to those most directly affected by the presence of the perpetrator, his neighbors. Hijos was really drawing a line in the sand that divided the criminal from the rest of the community, and it was then up to the community to decide whether they would remain on their own side of the line by carrying out that social sentence issued by the escrache, or if they wanted to cross that line by continuing to ignore the unpunished crimes of their neighbor. The escrache is also a beautiful example of this practice of transmission of memory. First of all, Hijos is nothing if not this example of this intergenerational transmission of affect, of memory, of trauma. For one, Hijos is a direct byproduct of the civil disobedience and the embodied practices of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and the grandmothers. And oftentimes the intergenerational transmission of trauma is theorized as this painfully unavoidable byproduct of mass violence, the legacy of pain that these subsequent generations must endure. But here, however, we're sort of seeing another side of that coin. While it would certainly, of course, be better if that initiating violence never took place to begin with, the transmission of memory in the Argentinian case has led to this level of human rights activism that might have never existed. So this transmission of traumatic memory has led to new understandings of political agency, which is being exercised by Hijos in ways that sometimes are mirroring the acts of the mothers and the grandmothers, but at other times contributing to this embodied practice and these sources of intersubjective power that were previously unheard of. But maybe more importantly, this transmission of memory is what leads to the transformation of that negative affect of that memory, that negative emotional power behind it, in the face of the damaging affective force of resonant violence, which operates to destroy horizontal voice and collective vertical voice, and to push people out of the public sphere. Hijos is representing a reversal of that force. By refusing to break apart and experience the pain of that intergenerational traumatic memory in silence and in isolation, the negative affect is actually transformed into something else, into what Diana Taylor calls the engine for cultural change. So this sentiment was really confirmed to me because I had one conversation with Tati Almeida, who is a leader in the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and I asked her about how she could perform this political activism in the face of such pain of losing her own son. And what she said to me, this is a quote, was, "Actually, that pain, that rage, what they did to us did not leave us with hate. No, we transformed it into love for our children and into a fight, a peaceful fight." So the co-embodied practices of the madres and hijos do not just transmit the memory of a violent past, but they transform it into something altogether different, more positive, productive, and potentially preventive of future violence. Hijos lived up to its promise to continue performing escraches until the justice happened. They would continue to make the escraches into the early 2000s, but ultimately they wouldn't have to continue for much longer. In 2001, the economic policies installed by the dictatorships and amplified by Menem all came crashing down, and there was a massive economic collapse in Argentina. Many, many people lost all of their money. It led to, of course, complete dissatisfaction with the state and dissatisfaction with the economic policies installed by the dictatorship, and a period of political chaos. Within 1 week after the crash, there were 5 different presidents in 1 week in Argentina. It was crazy. But it also provided an opening for new leaders to address the unfinished business of dealing with the past. And that's what's happened with the election in 2003 of Nestor Kirchner, who you see here with his wife, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who became president after Nestor's first term in office. And they really ushered in this period that we can call justice in full. It was a radically different economic agenda that responded to the neoliberal policies of the 90s and sort of tried to dismantle those policies that created the economic collapse. But also, Kirchner immediately started to work with the courts to nullify the laws of impunity. He had the presidential pardons declared unconstitutional, and that paved the way for reopening trials against the perpetrators, and that started in 2005. So now we see a return to transitional justice and the state actively dealing with the past. Despite this period of backward steps, the administration and civil society groups used that moment of dissatisfaction and instability to address the resident violence actively and to develop a culture of memory, truth, and justice. So, as it stands today, well over 1,000 perpetrators now have been brought to trial. Over 500 of them have received sentences. Financial reparations have been made to the families of the victims. The state's also developed a number of policies to support victims and their families in other ways, including counseling and other forms of mental health assistance. There's an Argentinian team of forensic anthropology that is still doing the difficult work of uncovering the remains of the thousands of bodies of disappeared peoples in the rivers in the Rio de la Plata. The grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, really interestingly, they were actually one of the first groups to take advantage of DNA technology as we started to learn more and more about it in the 90s. They were the first ones to have this idea, okay, let's create a DNA bank. So they all gave blood so that if anyone suspected that they had been illegally appropriated, or if someone suspected of them, that person could go get a DNA test and find out if they were in fact illegally appropriated, if their parents had been killed by the regime, and then they could meet their biological family again. So to date, they've recovered 119 of the roughly 500 children who were born in captivity. So obviously still hundreds of people living and not knowing that their parents were murdered by the state, but they're continuing that work. All of these things help to contribute to an active culture of memory in Argentina. This is the new Park of Memory in Buenos Aires, and you see here a mother looking at the name of her child who was disappeared. All of these achievements I've mentioned, trials, reparations, recovery of appropriated children, are examples of what can happen in a society that actively recognizes and deals with past human rights abuses. But the comprehensive work of confronting resident violence is also visible in these more symbolic practices that demonstrate how dedicated people are what Elizabeth Yellen, a memory scholar in Argentina, calls memory entrepreneurs. What these memory entrepreneurs can ensure that the past remains active in the present so that it prevents the return of that violence in the future. So as I said, today the mothers are still marching every Thursday, reminding the world that that their children have still not returned to them. The grandmothers are continuing their search as well, as I said. One of the most important examples, and how I'll end this presentation, is of how Argentina's relationship to its own violent past has changed can be seen in the transformation of ESMA, which I mentioned earlier. It was the largest of the concentration and torture centers during the dictatorship, the former Navy training school. And now it has been turned into a site of memory, and we can really look at this as a microcosm of how Argentinian society as a whole is relating to the past. In 2004, President Kirchner took ESMA back from the military, which still owned it and had been using it. In a very important symbolic moment, he had a military officer take down the portrait of Videla, the first president of the junta, from the complex, and declared ESMA to be now a site of memory. So today, this site is actually quite big. It's not just one building. It's over 30 different buildings that spread over 42 acres, right in the middle of a residential area in Buenos Aires. It's been transformed as a means to honor the victims of the past violence, but also to keep their memory alive, to promote human rights, and to nourish a culture of memory that will prevent that violence in the future. So one of the buildings, only one of the buildings was a site where actually the torture was taking place and where people were detained. This is so you can tour those that building now when you visit ESMA. This is a room called Capucha. In there it's called Capucha, which means hood, because here prisoners were packed in like sardines and made to wear hoods so they couldn't see their fellow prisoners. But the other buildings on the site, they had to figure out what to do with them too, and they came up with some really interesting and creative solutions. This is one building that has now been turned into a cultural center where you can see art exhibitions, film screenings, theatrical performances, concerts. The only prerequisite is that they have to have something to do with the theme of memory. There's a library, a book, or a bookstore, and a coffee shop here as well. So what they're really trying to do is make an attitude of thinking about the past and human rights related to that an active part of people's daily lives. So people can come to this space, have a coffee, read a book, and think about the promotion of human rights today. This is a picture of one art exhibition happening there. So you can see it's not just like pictures of the disappeared. It's some really, I've seen some really great stuff there. Other buildings were given to non-governmental organizations and human rights groups. This building is now the National Archive of Memory, which contains testimony and documentary information of the violence that happened during the dictatorship. This building was given to the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. It's now a cultural center for children to go after school and on the weekends to learn about human rights and to learn about the past. So these are really just a few examples of the ways that today Argentina engages with that violent past in a preventive mode. But like I said, it demonstrates that dealing with the past is this difficult and long-term process. And like genocide itself, it doesn't just happen overnight. It's a process that involves all sectors of society working in dedicated and really in creative ways. So I'm going to end with one specific creative practice that I especially like to show you of how Argentina is addressing the past. One of the organizations housed within ESMA hosted one particularly vibrant group-embodied practice in 2008. It was the 30th anniversary of the 1978 World Cup final, which was held at the Club River Plate Stadium, about 1 mile away from ESMA. In this championship match, Argentina defeated the Netherlands and they claimed the World Cup. It was played just a few corners from ESMA during the height of the violence. And this match was more than just a small moment of celebration amidst the repression of the dictatorship. It was an opportunity that the military junta was using to show the world that everything was okay in Argentina. So the public exaltation surrounding the World Cup victory did a great deal in distracting the world and distracting Argentina's soccer-obsessed population from the massive political violence that was happening around them. So in response to that historic event and in honor of the disappeared, one group hosted this event that they called La Otra Final, or the other final, the other World Cup final, the match for life and human rights. Thousands of people gathered in ESMA, including many members of the mothers, the grandmothers, and hijos. They unfurled a banner with all of the pictures of the known disappeared, and it spread for several city blocks. They walked, carrying it out of ESMA, out of the place of their torture and death, to the River Plate Stadium, and they were joined there by many other people. One large section of the stadium was left open and with a banner that said 30,000 detained disappeared, present. And the box seats where the junta sat was closed off and cordoned off as a sign of condemnation. Two teams played an exhibition match of two 25-minute halves as the crowd cheered them on. The teams were formed by a variety of players, including 3 players from the 1978 national team. There were ex-political prisoners and detainees from the dictatorship, children of several families that went into exile during the dictatorship, and the Argentinian National Youth League. This match was broadcast live on TV and radio, and after the match ended in a 1-1 tie, there was a concert where several well-known and well-respected musicians performed for the crowd. So we see here this mixing of the pain of the past with the joy of Argentina's national pastime, and this was an experience that many people that I talked to described as a feeling of exorcism, or sort of exorcising the demons of the past. So I'm going to end by calling on another voice or another medium for conveying the story of Argentina. When the participants of La Otra Final entered the stadium, an Argentinian musician named Daniel Villetti, who you see here, was playing a song. The lyrics come from an Uruguayan poet named Circe Maya, and the song is called Otra Voz Canta, or Another Voice Sings. And it's a song that was written about the disappeared and of the presence of the disappeared. I want to just play that for you. There's subtitles on the screen.
Por detrás de mi voz, escucha, escucha, otra voz canta. Viene de atrás, de lejos, viene de sepultadas bocas y canta. Dicen que no están muertos, escucha, los escucha, mientras se alza la voz que los recuerda y canta. Escucha, escucha, otra voz canta. Dicen que ahora viven en tu mirada, sosténlos con tus ojos, con tus palabras, sosténlos con tu vida, que no se pierdan, que no se caigan. Escucha, escucha, otra voz canta. No son solo memoria, son vida abierta, continua y ancha, son camino que empieza. Cantan conmigo, conmigo cantan. Dicen que no están muertos, escúchalos, escucha, mientras se alza la voz que los recuerda y canta. Cantan conmigo, conmigo cantan. No son solo memoria, son vida abierta, son camino que empieza y que nos llama. Cantan conmigo, conmigo cantan, cantan conmigo, conmigo cantan, cantan conmigo, conmigo cantan.
So this song was written obviously as a tribute to the disappeared, and it stresses that the dead are not dead at all. Their voices call out, saying that they are still alive, that they have not been lost. In an emotional transposition of words, Viglietti says that the disappeared sing with him, but also that they sing through him, through his body. Similarly, La Otra Final, the other final, is an example of a practice that re-embodies the disappeared, making them present both through highlighting their absence through the empty stands that were reserved for them, and by symbolically carrying them out of the place of their torture and death to a place of joy. They were unable to celebrate with their countrymen as their team won the World Cup championship in 1978, but now there's another final being played, just like there's another voice singing. And this one is especially for them. This staging of conflicting emotions serves as a means for transforming the resonant violence of the past into the productive force of a united stand against such violence in the present. Through a collective, embodied practice, a spectacular display of joy and commitment, a place with a troubling history is expunged of its guilt, its dirty past. It again becomes a place for community and passionate living. In other words, participants convert the enduring effects of resonant violence into new and vibrant sources of power and agency. Thanks so much. Great, so I guess we have some time for questions if there are any, or comments. Yeah?
How similar you see the old Argentinian dictatorships in terms of like a certain presidential candidate we have right now? How many similarities you might see? Or if you see it similar at all?
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I'm supposed to repeat the question. He asked if there are similarities between the dictatorship and certain current presidential candidates. I mean, I think that one thing that's been particularly troubling is not just this, and this isn't just about Argentina, similarities with Argentina, but if you look, I mean, you can go on, for instance, the Office for the Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide at the United Nations, and they publish a list of risk factors for countries, risk factors for countries to turn genocidal, or potentially perform mass atrocities. And some of the things that are being said in the current political campaigns, I think, if they were happening in an African country right now, we would be calling them incitement to genocide. And those people would be looked at as, those would be seen as risk factors. But because we're in the United States, this supposedly stable democracy, they're not being called for what they are. And I think that if we're talking about the process of these small steps that put a country at risk to perform genocide, I mean, I think a lot of things that are being said, if they were happening in another country, would be considered pre-genocidal rhetoric. I'm not saying that the U.S. will turn into a genocidal state, but that's something that if we want to be really self-reflexive, we should think about that. Thanks. Yeah?
so it's also trying to do that. Could the government
So you're just asking what how the government responded to the work of the mothers, or? Well, I mean, I guess we don't know what would have happened if the mothers weren't such a big force in Argentina. The mothers were absolutely a huge contributing factor in dismantling the power of the dictatorship because, and actually, the real power came from the fact that they were women, these middle-aged housewives, because the government from the beginning were like, oh, we don't have to worry about them, they're just these women, you know? And the fact that they kept presenting themselves in the public sphere when no one else could, if they were, if the men had done it, for instance, or if young people had done it, it probably is more likely that they would have been disappeared. So the fact that they used that to their advantage, that they continued to present themselves in the public sphere, I was constantly doing the work of dismantling the power of the dictatorship. And not just the power of the dictatorship, but then when we went into this period of impunity in Argentina, the mothers, just like hijos, the mothers were still marching every Thursday, still demanding the return of their children. They, to this day, now we're losing a lot of them because they're much older now and in their 80s and 90s. But to this day, they still keep up that fight. They don't want their children to be forgotten. And importantly, the mothers' work is not just about marching. They do a lot of other work now in Argentina that's more broadly human rights related. So they've expanded their own mission. So they've done a lot of things that are, ultimately, I see them as preventive of the return of future violence. Yeah. Yeah?
Is the military still an alternative for Argentina? Does the military still perceive itself as the savior of Argentina?
So is the military still an alternative? Right now, no. They've done a really good job of dismantling the power of the military, and it's not a threat any longer. Also, one of the things that I didn't mention that Kirchner brought, well, I guess it started before Kirchner with one other civil society group called CELS, but then it was really institutionalized by President Kirchner, is this process called impugnación, which if any military person gets was up for a promotion, then they have to sit in front of the Congress now and go through a long vetting process. And if they had anything to do with the violence perpetrated during the dictatorship, they won't receive the promotion. So the military right now is not a threat like it is in some other Latin American countries. For instance, in Brazil, the military is much, much stronger and much more of a presence, though they have currently worked out a sort of bargain with the government where it doesn't seem that there will be a military coup again in Brazil. But Argentina, the military is not a strong force like it was in the past now, thankfully. Yeah. Yes?
Steps in 1976. What did the fact that Argentina became such a haven for ex-Nazis, how did that factor in as to where Argentina was?
Yeah, so the question is, was there any impact, or how did it affect things, the fact that Argentina really became a haven for a lot of ex-Nazi officers after the Holocaust? I mean, ultimately, this didn't have a lot of impact on the repertory processes, but what's very interesting about Argentina is not only did it become a site or a haven for ex-Nazi officers, but it also became a site of immigration for a lot of Jews who survived the Holocaust. Argentina has one of the largest Jewish populations in the world. I think it's in the top 10. It's really, and then the Jewish community is a very influential and visible community in Buenos Aires, especially. But I mean, the idea of the trials definitely sprung from the Nuremberg trials, but I don't know if there was necessarily a lot of influence and our impact because of the presence of ex-Nazi officers. Of course, Eichmann was captured in Argentina. So that's an example of the presence of those Nazi officers. But no, to my knowledge, it didn't have a lot of impact on the figuring out reparatory policy, except on the idea of the trial. Yes?
As U.S. citizens, we were complicit in this, but we didn't know it. So what do we watch out for today? Maybe we're doing something like this today?
Yeah, it's true. The U.S. was really complicit in this and most of the other dictatorships in Argentina. And one particularly disappointing moment when President Obama went last week to Argentina, again, he came on the day of the 40th anniversary of the coup, which many people in Argentina saw as a bit of a slap in the face, to have this world power that really was complicit in perpetrating this coup, to come on the day, which is now a national holiday for them, of remembrance. And it was disappointing that President Obama didn't offer an apology. We still haven't offered an apology. He did, very importantly, say that they're going to open up some of the records, the classified documents that show the role that the U.S. had in that regime. But you're right. There are other regimes now that we are complicit in one or more ways. It's difficult to say what we can do, except look to the way that civil society operated in Argentina. I think to me it's so inspiring that it really was these groups working at the grassroots level that were so far ahead of the way that the state was responding to that violence, and they had a huge influence and impact on the way that the state deals with the past today. So when we think about the civil society movements that are happening right now in this country, it's quite inspiring to me. Sometimes they look like they're not getting stuff done. But for instance, I don't think Bernie Sanders' candidacy would be possible right now if Occupy Wall Street hadn't happened a few years ago. And that Occupy Wall Street is often talked about as a failure because they didn't have achievable goals or anything. But I think that it's a direct correlation to why Bernie Sanders is such a popular candidate right now. So I think we just have to keep doing that work of making sure that alternative voice is present in the public sphere. It's really difficult, but I mean, as American citizens, we do have a big responsibility for a lot of the violence that has happened and is happening around the world. Yeah.
Speak a little bit about what about the loss in the Falklands? How else the fall of the military coup?
Yeah, I mean, it really was just about. The war in the Falklands was about a show of military might, a reassertion of military influence and power. And the way that they presented it to the public is we're going to go in there, we're going to take it back, it's going to be, the Las Malvinas will be Argentinian again, and it's going to take just a couple of days. And the fact that that discourse of might was then completely, all the smoke and mirrors of that might was totally disrupted by the defeat at the hands of the British Navy. That it was impossible for them to sustain themselves in power after that. People started, the same people who were, like tens of thousands of people who were rallying in the Plaza de Mayo in support of the war, were then rallying in the Plaza de Mayo calling for the end of the dictatorship. So it was there were huge protests in the streets calling for the end of the dictatorship, and it was too much resistance for even the military to put down anymore. Does that answer your question?
It has something to do with England's influence, or in some ways part of the victory that forced the military to step down from power.
Yeah, I don't think that was so much the case, because Thatcher was one of the people who was also supporting the rise of the dictatorship, because they were installing the economic policies that she was sort of pushing along. So it wasn't so much that, it's just that when they took British territory, to be clear, there are always referendums in the Falkland Islands for these 300 people living there, asking them who they want. Do they want to be Argentine or do they want to be British? I think the British would be very happy to get rid of the Falkland Islands, but everyone there wants to be part of Britain. So it's not like Britain is holding them captive. Everyone there considers themselves British. They don't speak Spanish. So, yeah. Yeah.
So I know that very recently as well in this history there's been torture by the U.S. in many places, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, for some examples. And I'm sure that torture is still being taught as in the place you were talking about in Georgia. What was the name of that again?
Well, it was the School of the Americas, and now it's the Western Hemispheric Institute for Security and Western Cooperation or something like this. Yeah, well, we don't totally know what's being taught at that school anymore. I think we can actually be pretty confident that they're not teaching necessarily those same torture techniques, because there was this, this big report in 2009. When did it come out about revealing all of the different techniques that we could definitely call torture that the U.S. was using, and there's been a concerted effort to push back from those, waterboarding being the most visible and notable of those things. I don't know how much we know about what's going on at that school anymore in Fort Benning. I think that right now we've taken our turn to not teaching those same techniques of torture as before, though, again, looking at the political discourse around the campaigns right now, we hear waterboarding being brought back into public discourse, so we'll see what happens. Yeah, it's scary. Yeah, I don't know fully.
Kerry, has the taming of the military in Argentina had any repercussions for Chile or Brazil? The military more careful, or the result of trying to witness what happened there?
The taming of the military in Argentina has had an effect on Chile and Brazil. I don't know. Each of those three countries has chosen to deal with its past in very different ways. Like I said, in Brazil, the military is still quite powerful, but the political establishment and the military have come to an agreement that there will not be another military coup. And they've been given certain political protections for agreeing to that. We haven't seen the levels of transitional justice that happen in Argentina happening in Brazil, for instance. They have had truth commissions, but no trials, and there's no hope of there being trials anywhere soon, I think, in Brazil. In Chile is a much more conservative country. The military is still very powerful and respected, and there's still a significant portion of the population that supports what the military did. Less people died and were disappeared in Chile. It was around 2,000, between 2,000 and 3,000 in Chile, but a much higher proportion of the population was detained and tortured. So we see a little difference in the mechanisms of violence, but the right in Chile is still really good at convincing. I mean, it's still pretty strong, and there's still a significant portion of the population that believes in what they did and that it was right. I don't think there's a risk of the military performing another coup anytime soon, because they have enough power and authority as things are going fine for them as it is. So, but they're all three really different countries that have dealt with the past in really different ways. Argentina's definitely been the most active and rigorous in installing these mechanisms of transitional justice, especially in the last decade. Thank you all so much.